Nebraska's corn crop seems to be in excellent shape under irrigation, but poor shape when without. The latest state report showed irrigated corn improving to 82% in good to excellent categories, but falling to only 39% in the same categories under dryland situations. Corn dented was listed at 51%, 19 points behind the average and 40 percentage points below last year. Some producers have already begun chopping corn for silage to use as another feed source for livestock. This week, we talked with UNL Extension beef feedlot specialist Galen Erickson about the ideal time to cut silage and how to ensure you get the best quality and quantity for your operation.
Well, silage season is just starting. You know, there's some keys that people should look at. Most times they judge it based on kernel maturity. So if we're a little behind this year on corn maturity, we see a lot of choppers starting this week, next week. So we're about a week behind normal. I think a lot of people are interested in putting up silage because of the benefits of use of silage for beef cattle. But we probably saw more last year because they were trying to salvage some drought acres than what we'll probably see this year.
You mentioned that we were behind. Let's talk about timing. When is the ideal time or one of the perfect times to cut that silage?
You know, the old recommendations are you look at milk line on that kernel and you judge it. And the old recommendations were 2/3 milk line, half milk line, maybe starting then. I prefer that people use moisture and dry matter, and so I think targeting 35% dry matter, hopefully that's at least 3/4 milk line or even just starting black layer, because our focus now more recently has been how do we get it as mature as possible but still have enough moisture for good fermentation.
The moisture there is the operative kind of...
Yeah, to get it packed well and fermented well, we think starting when it's about 35% dry matter or 65% water, and you don't want to get drier than 40% dry matter or 60% water, because then you have a hard time packing it, getting the air out, and making sure it ferments well.
This year's a little different than last year. In the eastern half of Nebraska, the drought isn't quite as severe as it was last year, but also corn price isn't nearly as high as it was last year. When you look at the competitiveness of the pricing of silage versus corn, what do you see?
Yeah, you know, we've revisited this because there's really not been a lot of focus on silage, but when corn jumped up, silage was much more attractive to us, and especially when forage supplies were low. Forage supplies are fairly large this fall. Corn's been dropping, and so silage is not as logical as it was before. We still think it can be economical. In our opinion, it's 7.65 times the corn price when it's standing in the field, and then you've got to account for losses and harvest costs and such to get to a good price delivered to the cattle. And that varies, frankly. A ratio is not always the best because it varies depending upon corn price.
So that 7.65 multiplier doesn't account for the extra costs.
Right, that's when it's standing in the field. You've got to add in a harvest and packing, and also have to handle shrink in that calculation. So there's a lot of information available on our webinar about this, but it gets pretty detailed, and everybody wants a ratio, but as corn gets cheaper, that ratio is impacted quite a bit.
Tell me about shrink and how important that is to determining what you're going to get out of it.
Well, for sure. Once you have your bunkers packed, it's just critical to cover them. You know, I'd encourage people to look at the data on various inoculants, make sure they're data-driven decisions. But you can go from being economical with 5 to 10% shrink to it not being economical with 15 to 20% shrink. So managing those relatively small changes in losses is important. And I would argue shrink is not just fermentation losses like people talk about. It's inaccurate weighing, inaccurate scales, spilling, tossing out the spoiled material. So people need to really pay attention and manage shrink and try and keep it to 10% or less.
We're very early and the crop is behind, but any signs or hints of mycotoxins or nitrates, anything like that that you've heard of so far?
Well, last year there was a much bigger concern for nitrates probably than this year, but it does depend a little bit on rainfall right now, and so we could have some nitrate challenges, and so I would encourage producers that if they have some drought stressed areas, that's probably prime areas to test for nitrate if they're harvesting it for silage. Good thing is when it goes through the ensiling process, nitrate levels do decrease some, but it's fairly inexpensive and easy to test. No, I haven't heard of any mycotoxin concerns, and we'll just have to wait and see how this harvest develops. I suspect historically Nebraska corn's good quality and we won't have much mycotoxin concern.
As Galen mentioned, UNL Extension has produced webinars on silage use and pricing. We'll link to those discussions on our website in case you're interested in seeing more detailed information. If you're concerned about nitrates in drought-damaged crops or other forages, you can bring a sample to Husker Harvest Days, where UNL Extension will be offering free testing. You're encouraged to bring a representative sample from the feedstuffs with the greatest risk. You can drop off your samples at the Big Red Building on 3rd Street, conveniently located near the Market Journal exhibit.